Get access to hundreds more exclusive history documentaries by downloading the History Hit app.
Sunday, the 21st of April, 1918. Captain Roy Brown, a Canadian pilot of the newly formed Royal Air Force, DSC, and commander of No. 209 Squadron's A Flight, was warming up the 150 horsepower rotary engine of his Sopwith Camel. The Camel was a mighty fighter, one of the greatest fighting machines of the First World War, but it was a beast to handle. This aircraft required the skills of experienced pilots, and Captain Brown was one such pilot. As Captain Brown took off for the Somme Valley, the engine groaned, spitting in and out. His thoughts were on keeping the aircraft aloft, constantly adjusting the controls. Little did he know that by 11:30 that morning, his name would be written down forever in the annals of aviation history, and he was personally going to be responsible for ending the seemingly immortal era of the highest-scoring fighter ace of the First World War, the legendary Manfred von Richthofen. Manfred von Richthofen was born on the 2nd of May 1892 in Kleinburg. The Richthofen ancestry was not one of soldiers and war, but one of country estates and rural life of the landed gentry. His father was practically the first member of his branch of the family to have become a soldier, but had to resign his post because of air trouble caused by saving one of his men from drowning. In Manfred's generation, however, military life became a matter of course, and with war looming, every able-bodied member of the Richthofen family was on active service. He spent his school years first in private tuition at Kleinburg and then at a school in Schweiznitz. He began his military career at the age of 11 in the Cadet Corps at Wahlstatt. In 1911, he joined the army in the 1st Regiment of Uhlans as a cavalryman. In fact, all of the Richthofens entered service as cavalrymen. By 1912, von Richthofen was an officer, and 2 years later, he went to war. In June 1915, he gained his first flying experience in war as an observer with the 69th Squadron of the Flying Service. On Christmas Day 1915, von Richthofen passed his final pilot's examination and began training as a fighter pilot. By September 1916, he'd scored his first victory. On the 20th of April 1918, he scored his 80th. Manfred von Richthofen had become a legend the world over. The Allied pilots, although fearing him, had a great amount of respect for this fighter ace and called him the Red Baron because of his distinctive red aircraft. This great pilot and great leader of men never made his 81st victory. The legacy of Manfred von Richthofen as a combat leader still exists today within the modern Luftwaffe. Jagerschwader 71 Richthofen, based at Wittmund in the north of Germany, consists of 2 squadrons, Jagdstaffel 712 and Jagdstaffel 711. The wing's emblem is the Richthofen R. Both squadrons proudly display the emblem of Richthofen's famous red Fokker triplane in their markings.
Ja, wir haben in der deutschen Luftwaffe 4 Geschwader.
There are 4 squadrons in the German Air Force which have received a traditional name.
Das ist das Geschwader Immelmann, das Geschwader
The
Bölke,
Immelmann
das Geschwader
Squadron, the
Mölders
Bolker Squadron,
und natürlich das
the
Geschwader
Mulder
Richthofen.
Squadron, the Richthofen Squadron.
1961 wurde dem Geschwader dieser Traditionsname verliehen. Und,
In 1961, the squadron was given this traditional name, and we bear this name with extraordinary pride.
Auf jedem Flugzeug, auf den Uniformen, vor allen Dingen das damals
On every car, on every aeroplane and uniform, and above all on every armband that was issued then.
Wo immer sich aufhält. Und die Tradition.
The Richthofen identifies himself wherever he may be.
Erwachsen, also Mut.
The tradition grew out of the name Richthofen, courage, bravery and humanity. We have taken them over into our Air Force. That Richthofen pin and badge, which I'm wearing myself, has become a sign of a corporate identity.
Zeichen von einer corporate identity geworden.
Wherever we are as a squadron, we are a member of the Richthofen Squadron. And with the name Richthofen, we can identify anywhere in the world, and we know who Richthofen was.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit brings you the stories that shaped the world through exclusive documentaries from the world's top historians. Travel with us to the bloody Battle of Stalingrad or uncover the lives of the people who called Pompeii home. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
Within the current fulfillment of its commitment to NATO and in the defence of its now reunited homeland, the wing carries on the traditions and embraces the spirit of its illustrious namesake, Manfred Von Richthofen. The current complement of Phantom F-4 aircraft are far more sophisticated than the string and canvas types of Richthofen's era. The modern-day fighter pilot is highly trained, having spent many years learning and studying his trade. In contrast, at the outbreak of World War I, fighter planes, fighter pilots, or any accepted doctrine for air combat were unknown, but war spurs rapid advancement. There were no pilot's notes or approved tactics memoranda to study. The fighting pilot had to learn his trade for himself, in action. This was the case with Manfred von Richthofen. The basic ideals, which proved so efficient during World War I, are still continued and practiced today, some 80 years later.
Die Familie von Richthofen datiert zurück bis zum Jahre 1500.
The Richthofen family dates back to about the year 1500.
Ein altes schlesisches Adelgeschlecht und hatte schon viele bedeutende.
It's an old Silesian noble family which brought forth many important and famous men, incling philosophers, scientists, and Baron Manfred von Richthofen.
Von Richthofen, der schon sehr früh daran geführt wurde,
who was encouraged early on to lead other people and to take over the responsibility for the family and his environment.
Für seine Umgebung zu übernehmen.
Manfred von Richthofen was an excellent horseman and a proficient hunter who liked nothing better than to spend the day in the saddle hunting on the family estate. He gloried in the challenge of competition and in the thrill of the hunt and the triumph of the kill.
Es gehörte einfach zur Ausbildung des Adels.
That was part of the education of the nobility. You started to ride very early.
Keine Flugzeuge und man hatte ja noch keine.
You didn't have aeroplanes and not so many cars yet.
Das Fortbewegungsmittel.
The means of transport was the horse. He was an extremely good rider.
Ein außerordentlich guter Reiter.
The transition from cavalry officer to airman seemed natural to Manfred von Richthofen. He saw military aviation as being the aerial cavalry of the 20th century and swiftly adapted his fighting and leadership talents. Manfred von Richthofen was the modern embodiment of the Teutonic knights in shining steel helmets and white cloaks that bore the Black Cross, sweeping across Europe centuries before. But he wasn't just a hunter, he was also a military organization man. He was a daring and cool-headed leader in battle. He was also a seasoned manager who knew how to use his resources to the best advantage and how to motivate those under his command.
Es lag also nahe, dass von Richthofen, als sich entschied, den Soldatenberuf zu übernehmen,
It was obvious when he decided to take up the profession of soldier that he would join the cavalry.
Hier war es seine Aufgabe, Aufklärung zu reiten. Aufklärung war ja die Hauptaufgabe der Kavallerie und deswegen
the cavalry's main task was reconnaissance.
In der Aufklärung mit der Kavallerie.
Then it was a natural transition that when von Richthofen later changed over to the Air Force, he would carry out reconnaissance with the first aeroplanes.
Aufklärung zu betreiben mit den ersten Flugzeugen.
As a fighter pilot, he wrote an Air Combat Operations Manual. One of the reports stated, "My favorite way of leading a Staffel is like hunting on horseback across a field. Then it is of no consequence if I turn, push ahead, or pull back." He also stated that the man who is a born horseman is almost always a born aviator. The steadiness of hand and quickness of eye which is necessary to a first-class game shot is equally necessary to the fighting pilot. Captain Manfred Von Richthofen was in his early 20s when he was at the height of his fame as a national hero and successful fighter pilot. This reconstruction shot after the war shows just what the conditions were like when engaging the enemy in aerial combat. As a young pilot, Manfred von Richthofen had been watching the almost daily reports of the exploits of such men as Max Immelmann and Oswald Boelcke on the Western Front. They were bringing down countless British and French machines and gaining high honors and rewards.
Eine ganz interessante Geschichte. Richthofen fuhr eines Tages
That's an interesting story. Richthofen took a train journey one day.
Sah an einem anderen Tisch
In the dining car, he saw at another table a young, highly decorated soldier and flying officer.
It
emerged when he'd asked him about his name that he was Oswald Boelcke. On that occasion, he felt the desire to become like Oswald Boelcke and be a well-known fighter pilot.
Oswald Boelcke war ein Staffelkapitän, der also eine Staffel.
Bolker was a squadron captain who had successfully led a squadron in the First World War. Together with Immelmann, he was one of the most successful fighter pilots of the time.
Und es lag also nahe, dass von Richthofen.
It was obvious that von Richthofen saw a model in Oswald Bolker. He wanted to emulate him.
Dem nacheifern wollte.
It was little wonder that many men desired to follow such illustrious paths to glory. Von Richthofen had his chance when the great Bolker, victor in 19 aerial fights during 1915 to 1916, was taken away from the war front and told to form fighting units of single-seat fighter scout aircraft. By mid-1916, the first 7 Jastas were being formed, with 8 more following by the August. Each Jasta consisted of 12 pilots, although this later rose to 18. With the opening of the Battle of the Somme, Bolker was ordered to head Jasta 11 and to recruit his own pilots. One of these was Manfred Von Richthofen. His career as a fighter pilot was about to begin. It was Bolker who opened the Jasta's scoring, bringing down 7 British aircraft in the first 2 weeks of September 1916. And on the 17th of September, Von Richthofen made his first victory. On the 28th of October, after scoring 40 air victories, Oswald Bolker's aircraft collided with another during an air battle. He died instantly.
Wenn ein Staffelführer, der so erfolgreich war,
when a squadron leader who was so successful and a national hero dies, the grief is very, very great. That was also the case in the Bolker squadron. The men had the feeling that they were falling into a big hole because their famous leader wasn't there anymore. They started at once to search for a successor, which proved to be extremely difficult. Bolker was a hero and had been treated as such, and heroes are difficult to replace. By now, Richthofen had scored 6 personal victories. The new lineup of Jasta 11, carrying on in Bolker's name following his death, went on to bring the score to a total of 86 between them up until the end of 1916. Von Richthofen's score had risen to 10, but it was to be his 11th which brought him his most important victory, and one which was to make him a national hero. On the 23rd of November, he shot down the British ace and hero, Major Lano Hawker. It was now that the legend of Baron Manfred von Richthofen was born.
Major Hawker war ja zu dem Zeitpunkt das englische Ass.
It was indeed. At the time, Major Hawker was the English flying ace and comparable to Bolker on the German side.
Und nachdem es nun Richthofen gelungen war, Major Hawker abzuschießen.
After Richthofen had succeeded in shooting down Major Hawker, in Germany the feeling arose they had again a new savior. Perhaps a new Siegfried. They had above all a new hero who could lead them out of the dilemma of the war. Richthofen had become the national symbol, the national hero.
Wurde durch diesen Abschuss erst zum nationalen Symbol, zum nationalen Helden. Außerordentlich wichtig, denn
it was extremely important. They really hoped to have found in Richthofen the hero who could maintain the morale of the civilian population at home in the fatherland.
Zu Hause im Vaterland wieder aufrechterhalten konnte.
No sooner had he established himself amongst the most successful air fighters of the German air service than he was given the command of his own group of 4 squadrons, Jasta 4, 6, 10 and 11. This group became known as his Flying Circus, JG No. 1. The squadrons flew in groups of between 6 to 15 aircraft, although occasionally they were sent out on lone ventures. The leader, von Richthofen, had chosen to paint his aircraft a brilliant red colour, making it easily identifiable in battle for the rest of his squadron to spot. First with his Albatross Scout and then later with his legendary trademark, the Fokker DR1 triplane. He wrote later that, "One fine day I came upon the idea of having my crate painted glaring red. The result was that absolutely everybody could not help but notice my red bird. In fact, my opponents also seemed to be not entirely unaware of it." But as notoriety arose for Jaster 11 under von Richthofen and his singular identifiable aircraft, concern spread for his safety amongst pilots, concerned that the British and French knew that he alone flew this red aircraft and had consequently put a price on his head for shooting down the Red Baron. It's interesting to note that during World War I, most of the German and Allied infantrymen on the ground knew very little about aircraft or their markings and found it difficult to distinguish which was friendly and which was the enemy. This resulted in many occasions where the pilots actually faced a barrage of bullets from their own side. All of Richthofen's men flew wonderfully. They had the best teachers. The squadrons were moved from place to place depending where the battle was thickest or wherever the British and French reconnaissance machines' activities had been the busiest. But as a rule, it concentrated on the British front. Wherever they pitched the tents, they would do the regular squadron performances in the morning, followed later in the day by lone raids or strafing flights. It's no wonder that with these brightly coloured machines and the twice-daily shows of aerial wizardry, they soon became known by the British as von Richthofen's travelling circus. Whenever possible, the British would try and locate the temporary airstrips and run strafing attacks on the aircraft on the ground, sometimes with devastating results. On the 10th of March 1917, a new pilot joined Richthofen's Jaster 11, Manfred's brother Lothar. The propaganda machine burst into action, for now there were two Richthofens flying together to defeat the enemy in the air.
Die beiden Brüder von Richthofen, Manfred von Richthofen und Lothar von Richthofen.
The two brothers von Richthofen, Manfred and Lothar von Richthofen, got on very well, but they were also very different.
Manfred von Richthofen der geborene Führer war.
Whereas Manfred von Richthofen was a born leader, Lothar von Richthofen was an extremely good pilot, but he didn't crave to take over the tasks of a leader. He felt quite comfortable in his brother's squadron.
Zu übernehmen. Fühlte sich also ausgesprochen wohl in der Staffel seines
He was successful with 40 planes being shot down.
Erfolgreich mit 40 Abschüssen.
Lothar later recalled, when I arrived at my brother's Staffel as a complete beginner, Manfred gave me one of his old machines in which he had attained his first 10 aerial victories. Likewise, he gave me a pair of his old leather flying gloves. As luck would have it, I shot down my first 10 Englishmen armed with these gloves and this machine. Lothar also noticed that other well-known flyers observed certain almost superstitious practices. For example, his brother Manfred achieved all of his aerial victories wearing the same old leather jacket. Kurt Wolff never flew without his lucky nightcap. As proof that these rituals should be followed, Lothar recalled that Kurt Windkens always flew with his riding crop, and the one time he left it behind in his quarters was the day he was killed. Oswald Bolker forbade his picture being taken just before starting out on a flight, and the one time this rule was violated was on the same day he died. Such was the skill of Lothar Richthofen as a fighting pilot that within 2 weeks he had shot down his first enemy. Von Richthofen was a model of daring and leadership in air war. He wrote his own Air Combat Operations Manual, which sets out in methodical detail the necessary elements to become successful in both initiating and repulsing air attacks. These are some of his basic principles. The commander flies to where the assembled Staffel leaders have taken up their prescribed places. It's advisable that each Staffel has its own emblem marking. The commander's aircraft must be very conspicuously painted. The aircraft in the formation should fly at the same altitude in a precise, organized formation. The most favorable situation is when one can get between an intruding enemy formation and the front. One cuts off its escape, gets above it, and forces it to fight. The continuous attack ensures success. Every individual counts the number of opponents the moment he sights them. When the offensive begins, everyone must ascertain where all of the enemy aeroplanes are at all times. The commander should not focus his attention on single enemy aircraft. He should fly towards the main body. Once the commander swoops into a dive to attack the enemy formation, it must be the aim of each and every pilot to be the first to engage the opposition. The one who is closest to an opponent is the one alone who should open fire on him. The simplest thing is to surprise a single-seat fighter from behind, then the main point is to make tighter turns to stay above the opponent. In individual combat, approach the enemy until about 50 meters behind him. Carefully take aim and fire. The opponent will fall. One does not need to be an aerobatics artist or a trick shooter, rather one has to have the courage to fly right up to the opponent. If attacked from a single-seater from above, never let up on the throttle, make all turns and dive at full speed. Turn towards the opponent and by pulling up in each turn, try to get above him and never let the enemy get on your back. One can attack a fighter from the front, but this is rare, as the moment for which one is in the right range for combat is only a fraction of a second. When the battle lasts until it is far on the other side and one is alone, one should never obstinately stay with an enemy who through bad shooting or skillful turning one has been unable to shoot down. For a beginner about to face the enemy, the following rules apply. We need no aerial acrobatics, just courageous daredevils. The pilot must master his machine gun by practicing at full speed in high altitude and tight turns. He must know the terrain without a map and the route to and from the front by heart. It is important to know what to do to keep from being shot down. The greatest danger is surprise attack from behind. Most of our pilots, even the best and most experienced, have been surprised and shot down from behind. One without fail must be aware of the airspace behind him. The opponent will look for the most favorable position, diving from out of the sun and shooting one down in a few shots. The correct method if surprised is a sudden and very tight turn and take the offensive as quickly as possible.
Es gab ja nichts, was man so aus der Schublade einfach herausziehen konnte.
There was nothing in the manual you could pull out of a drawer and copy. The techniques and tactics all had to be invented anew.
Neu erfunden werden. Und es zeichnet ganz besonders Richthofen aus, dass in der Lage war,
It was a distinguishing fact of Von Richthofen that he was able to put down his theories on paper so that everybody could read them.
Damals aufgeschrieben hat, ist
What he wrote down in those days is still important and correct today. Richthofen insisted that his pilot should be the best. There was a feeling of strong competition as they all tried to draw level with their leader. However, his feelings about his enemy were mixed. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Everything depends on whether we have for opponents those French tricksters or those daring fellows, the English. I prefer the English. Frequently, the daring of the latter can only be described as stupidity. In their eyes, it may be pluck and bravery. The great thing in air fighting is that the decisive factor does not lay in trick flying, but solely in the personal ability and energy of the aviator. A flying man may be able to loop and do all the tricks imaginable, and yet he may not succeed in shooting down a single enemy. In my opinion, the aggressive spirit is everything, and that spirit is very strong in Germans, hence we shall always retain domination of the air." The French have a different character. They like to set traps and to attack their opponent unawares. That cannot easily be done in the air. Only a beginner can be caught, and one cannot set traps because an aeroplane cannot hide itself. The invisible aeroplane has yet to be discovered. Sometimes, however, the Gaelic blood asserts itself. The Frenchman will attack. But the French attacking spirit is like bottled lemonade that lacks tenacity. In Englishmen, on the other hand, one notices that they are of Germanic blood. Sportsmen take easily to flying, but the Englishmen see flying as nothing but a sport. They take perfect delight in looping the loop, flying on their back and rolling over and indulging in other tricks for the benefit of our soldiers in the trenches. All these tricks may impress someone who attends a sports meeting, but the public at the battlefront is not so appreciative of such things. It demands higher qualifications than trick flying. The The rules that applied to confirmed victories for a pilot's score were simple. If the aircraft was shot down on the German side of the lines, the enemy aeroplane, whether intact or wrecked, had to be located at the place the pilot claimed to have shot it down. This had to be verified either by other men in the air or by ground observers. Any that fell on Allied soil were often not confirmed unless somebody else actually saw it crash beyond repair, burn, or it was subsequently shelled by gunfire and seemed to be destroyed. This system did not leave much room for a pilot to try and increase his own score, either by deception or by taking another's claim. Anyone who tried and was caught out soon left the frontline squadron. On the British side of the lines, confirming a victory was more difficult, but as long as the aeroplane attacked was seen to crash, burn, or in some way be destroyed, and was verified by either ground or air observers, it was credited to the victorious pilot. However, with the difficulty of flying in high altitude, perhaps being hotly engaged by enemy aircraft, it wasn't always possible to observe the fate of an aircraft that appeared to be going down for the last time. This gave rise to the claim out of control, or OOC. Pilots, of course, used this spinning down maneuver as a ruse to get out of trouble, and when near the ground would regain proper control and fly off. But provided another pilot confirmed what he also thought was a machine going down out of control and looking certain to crash, this probable victory was confirmed and listed as a victory. It was often claimed by the Allies that Baron von Richthofen didn't play fair in air warfare by surprising his victims from behind and giving them no chance to defend themselves. This was probably true, but that's exactly the job of a fighter pilot, or scout pilot as they were known in World War I, to destroy the maximum enemy forces with the minimum risk to himself and his fellow pilots. By his very trade, he has to gain the advantage of position to strike. Why risk a dogfight when you may come off worse when you can down the opponent without being seen before it's too late? It may not sound chivalrous, but it got the job done, and in von Richthofen's case, done well. One target that von Richthofen never attacked, yet some of the more inexperienced pilots did, were the Allied observation balloons. For he considered these to be a most dangerous target, as they were well protected from the ground crews and by Allied scout patrols. A quick and easy kill to shoot down one of the balloons in a hail of bullets, leaving the balloonists to parachute to safety and watching the balloons plummet to the ground in a ball of fire. But that swift and seemingly easy kill left the attacker in a vulnerable position and often ended in an equally swift death. Richthofen fought his battles by staying cool, calm and collected, never going for an all or nothing, which is perhaps the main reason why he achieved his final score of 80 aerial victories.
Ich glaube, das größte Plus von Richthofen war, dass
I think the big advantage of von Richthofen was that he could motivate his co-pilots, the pilots of his squadron, by demonstrating everything.
Das heißt, ist der Erste gewesen, der in der Luft war, und ist der Letzte
He was the first in the air and the last to land again.
Sich schützend vor seine Leute gestellt.
He stood protectively in front of his people. He protected them in air fights.
All seine Erkenntnisse in Technik.
He passed on all his knowledge of technique and above all tactics to his men, and that makes him so special that he was able to analyze people in such a way to transform relevant actions into his own actions and to pass them on to his men.
Die entsprechenden Handlungen umzusetzen in eigene Handlungen.
That became clear when he took over Squadron 11, which hadn't been so successful before that.
Als die Staffel 11 übernahm,
the shootdowns increased from one day to the next.
Steigerten sich von heute auf morgen die Abschusszahlen.
Baron von Richthofen kept a trophy room at the family estate in Schweiznitz. This was the room of the great hunter, the walls full of memorabilia and serial numbers on patches of fabric taken from the aircraft that he had downed. This collection seen here was lost after the Second World War when the family fled from the Soviet occupation. It has never been seen since. April 1917 became known as Bloody April to the British, losing 1/3 of their complement of pilots in that month alone. Why was German dominance so strong in the war in the air, and in particular, why was Manfred von Richthofen so successful in shooting down the enemy?
Zuerst einmal hatte natürlich eine ganze Menge Glück. Aber Glück hat eben halt nur der Tüchtige.
A very difficult question, because first of all, he had a lot of luck. Only efficient people are lucky, that's been proved.
Hatte gute Techniken,
he was courageous, he had good technique, good tactics.
Hat sich nie in einen Luftkampf hineingewagt, von dem von vornherein wusste,
he would never have dared to enter an airfight if he knew in advance that he wouldn't be able to win it.
Gut ausgebildete Piloten gehabt, die als ein Team
He had well-trained pilots who flew together as a team, no individualists. They were as one.
Hat ja auch das Jagdgeschwader 1 aufgestellt.
He had also established Fighting Group 1, which combined several squadrons. He was able to group forces together. That was why he was so extraordinarily successful.
So außerordentlich erfolgreich gewesen.
Baron von Richthofen scored his 80th victory on the 20th of April 1918 when he shot down a British Sopwith camel. The next day, on the 21st of April, he was to come up against another camel, in fact, 7 of them. Richthofen led one flight, whilst Lieutenant Hans Wolff led the second. Lieutenant Wolff, in a letter to Manfred's brother Lothar, wrote, "Scarcely had we arrived at the front in the area around Hamel, when from the side and below us we saw 7 Sopwith camels. In addition to the 5 of us, Jasta 5 were still in the vicinity, but much further away in the valley of Sailly-le-Sac." Above us were 7 more Sopwith camels, some of which attacked Jasta 5 whilst the others remained above. 1 or 2 came at us, we began to fight. In the course of the fight I saw that Herr Rittmeister was often near me, but he had not shot anything yet. While Lieutenant Major Caius and I fought against 2 or 3 camels, suddenly I saw the red machine near me as he fired at a camel that first went into a spin and then slipped away in a steep dive to the west. This fight took place on the other side over the heights of Hamlet. We had a rather strong east wind, and Herr Rittmeister hadn't taken that into account. As I now had clear air around me, I got closer to a camel and shot it down. As the camel went down, I looked over at Herr Rittmeister and saw that he was at an extremely low altitude over the Somme, near Corby, and he was right behind an Englishman. I shook my head instinctively and wondered why Herr Rittmeister was following an opponent so far on the other side. While I was looking to see where my opponent had fallen, suddenly I heard a machine gun behind me and saw that I was being attacked by another camel, which had already put 20 holes into my machine. When I luckily got free of that one, I looked around for Herr Rittmeister, but saw no one except Caius, who was close alongside me. Then I became uneasy, as I certainly should have seen Herr Rittmeister. We circled the area for a time and were then again attacked by an Englishman who followed us for about 900 meters over Corby. But of Herr Rittmeister, there was no trace. With a sense of foreboding, I came home. Reports had come in that a red triplane had landed smoothly northwest of Corby. That he was not shot down from behind, I could vouch for. That would have been the most terrible thing for me, as I considered myself to be the personal shield of Herr Rittmeister. Had he succeeded in shooting down the Englishman, then he would have pulled up, but he didn't. He suddenly went into a steep dive and had apparently landed smoothly. Although they had become accustomed to death and destruction, his comrades waited for news. They hoped that their leader would be spared the fate of so many of his victims. The following day they received news confirming that Richthofen's plane had gone down within British lines. By all accounts, Rittmeister Manfred von Richthofen was killed at about 11:45 a.m. German time while hotly pursuing Sopwith F1 Camel D3326 of No. 209 Squadron of the British Royal Air Force. While Richthofen chased his intended victim, Second Lieutenant Wilfred May, at even lower altitude along the Somme River Valley, he was himself fired upon by Captain Roy Brown, May's squadron leader. It's also known that Australian gun batteries on the ground opened fire on the red Fokker triplane. At that height, the aircraft would have appeared as blurred images to the troops on the ground, but the gunners knew by now that a khaki image was friendly and a red one was the enemy. Captain Roy Brown claimed the credit for shooting down the Red Baron. As he'd become known, so too did the 53rd Australian Field Artillery Battery. Lieutenant Richard Wenzel, another of the Richthofen Circus, follows the same view that Richthofen was shot down by ground fire. Over the lines, we attacked 7 Sopwith camels with red noses, the anti-Richthofen people. Due to the strong east wind, we drifted farther and farther over the other side. I saw that one of our machines was in trouble. I thought I recognized it as Richthofen's machine. We broke off combat and went back over the lines. One by one we landed, only Richthofen was missing. Another member of the squadron recalls that another Englishman could have shot him down from behind was out of the question. The possibilities are that the engine quit or that shots fired from the ground hit the aircraft.
Ist es wirklich wichtig zu wissen, wer Richthofen abgeschossen hat?
The question is it really important to know who shot von Richthofen? Opinions differ widely.
Und für mich ist es im Grunde
As far as I'm concerned, I don't mind whether he was shot down from the ground or by Captain Brown.
ob Captain Brown ihn abgeschossen hat.
He had perhaps not considered one of his own rules.
Eine seiner Regeln nicht beachtet. In May,
when he flew, the strong east wind had pushed him across the enemy lines, and it's quite possible, because both aeroplanes were extremely low, that he was shot down from the ground.
Dass weil beide Flugzeuge außerordentlich tief waren, dass eben durch Maschinengewehrfeuer vom Boden aus abgeschossen worden ist. Wie ich gerade sagte, er hat einen großen Fehler gemacht. Er ist eben halt nicht wieder zurückgekehrt. As
I've just said, he'd made a big mistake. He did not return when he saw, or perhaps he hadn't seen them, but he'd flown over the enemy lines. It was a war of positions at the time, and the enemy lines or trenches were not easily recognizable. He might have been too busy chasing Lieutenant May, so that he didn't see that he'd crossed over the enemy lines on that day.
An dem Tag herrschte, und das weiß man aus einem Brief,
And we now know from a letter from Lieutenant Wolf to Lothar Richthofen that there was a strong east wind, and you could say, when you look at this construction of fabric and wood, that he was blown over the line. Second Lieutenant May of the RAF, Richthofen's intended 81st victim, later reported the following: "Through lack of experience, I held my guns open too long. One jammed, and then the other, so I spun out of the mess and headed west into the sun for home. The first thing I knew was that I was being fired upon from the rear, and all I could do was to try and dodge my attacker. I noticed that it was a red triplane, but if I'd realized then that it was Richthofen, I would probably have passed out on the spot." I kept on spinning and dodging for around 12,000 feet until I ran out of sky and had to hedgehop over the ground. British and German ground troops were firing at us. We passed over the Somme River and started up the valley at a very low altitude. Richthofen was close on my tail. At this point I was a sitting duck, as I was too low down to make a turn away from him. Captain A. Roy Brown completes the report. "We went back again and dived down on a pure red triplane which was firing on Lieutenant May. I got in a long burst and the triplane went down vertical and was observed to crash by Lieutenant Mellersh and Lieutenant May. Whether he was shot from an aircraft or from the ground, the fact is that von Richthofen, only 26 years old and a master of aerial combat, had violated a point of his own air combat manual, and in making that one vital error suffered the consequences. One should never obstinately stay with a target which, through bad shooting or skillful turning, he has been unable to shoot down when the battle lasts until it is on the other side and one alone is faced by a greater number of opponents." Richthofen's plane had ploughed into a field. He was dead, a single bullet through the heart. His body was removed from the wreck by Australian ground troops and taken to the Australian Flying Corps base at Poulainville. At 4 p.m. on the 22nd of April, Richthofen's coffin was taken to the cemetery in nearby Bertangle. The funeral attracted many Allied airmen who were paying their last respects to a great pilot and worthy adversary. Baron Manfred Von Richthofen was buried with full military honours in a service that was captured on motion picture film. A short while later, a lone British aircraft dropped a wreath and a message containing official confirmation of his death.
Genauso wie Richthofen, als Hawker abschoss.
By the same token, when Hawker was shot down by Richthofen, the grief was very great in Britain.
Zuerst wollte man es gar nicht glauben.
At first, nobody wanted to believe it, and it took 2 or 3 days until they could believe that Richthofen was no longer alive.
Es war ja April 1918.
It was April 1918. The end of the war was almost in sight, and it was symptomatic that the death of Richthofen hastened the end of the war.
Der Tod Richthofen das Ende des Krieges vorausnahm. 1925 wurde ja überführt.
In 1925, he was transported from France to the Invalids Cemetery in Berlin until after World War II.
In der Zeit bis nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg war der Invalidenfriedhof.
The Invalid Cemetery was a very honored place where many famous people are buried.
Ort, wo sehr viele berühmte Deutsche begraben sind. Aber als dann die deutsche Demokratische
When the DDR built the wall went directly over the Invalid Cemetery. Nobody cared for the graves. They were in no man's land.
Und man kümmerte sich überhaupt nicht mehr um die Gräber. Sie lagen im Niemandsland und da hat sich die Familie entschlossen.
The family decided in 1975 to transfer the remains to the South Cemetery in Wiesbaden.
Nach Wiesbaden auf den Südfriedhof. Man kann vielleicht an der Verehrung oder man kann vielleicht die Verehrung.
You can see the admiration for Richthofen in those days when the train which transported his coffin to Berlin stopped at every station.
Bertangle, wo ja begraben wurde von der Royal Air Force. Überführt wurde 1925.
At each town and village, he was honored by speeches and the laying down of wreaths. Even in his death, he was still a national hero.
Nun durch die deutschen Lande fuhr, musste überall anhalten und überall wurde
This was exactly the case. The train that carried the remains to Berlin had to stop everywhere, and old warriors and veterans societies paid him the last honors by laying down wreaths and addresses.
Zu einem Helden auf.
If you like, on such occasions, Richthofen was resurrected.
Wenn Sie so wollen, ist Richthofen da wieder auferstanden.
General von Hoepner sent a note of condolence to Richthofen's men. It read, "Stronger than Richthofen's words were his deeds. It was granted to him to be confirmed and honored to live as a leader and to be cherished as a comrade. We will not direct our gaze on what could have been, rather from what he was. We will derive a living force, a force that stays alert in permanent memorial to his deeds." That memorial is still alive today at Wittmund, as Richthofen's gravestone, saved from the Invalid Cemetery in Berlin, stands between the two gate guards as a proud reminder of the heritage of Jagdgeschwader 71, Richthofen. A memorial to a man that was a born leader who died a national hero, but he wasn't always at ease with such fame and glory. He once wrote, "The battle now taking place on all fronts has become dreadfully serious, for now we must arm ourselves against despair. I imagine now how death would feel breathing down my neck. I'm no longer so insolent in spirit. I've been told by people in high places that I should give up flying, but I'd be miserable with myself if now, burdened with glory and decorations, I were to become a pensioner of my own dignity in order to save my life for the nation whilst every poor fellow in the trenches gives his. I am wretched in spirits after every aerial combat. I go directly to my room. I do not want to see anyone or hear anything. I feel that the war is not as people imagine it, with a roar and a cheer. It is very serious, very grim."
Es ist sehr, sehr schwer, sich hineinzuversetzen in einen Mann, der im Kriege hervorragende.
It is very difficult to imagine a man who has performed excellent deeds in war.
Das ist ganz schwer nachzuvollziehen. Aber ich denke mal von seiner
We live in peace now. It's very difficult to imagine that.
Von seiner Erziehung her war Richthofen ein Mann.
I always think that from his education, from his training, Richthofen was a man who was extraordinarily courageous on the one hand, but who, on the other hand, also thought about war and the consequences of the war.
Die Folgen des Krieges nachgedacht hat. War nicht der Killer, der also unbedingt sein.
He wasn't a killer who needed a shoot-down for his breakfast. Especially towards the end of the war, he'd become a very reflective man.
Mann geworden, und es gibt ein Bild von ihm, wo mit 25 Jahren abgebildet wurde.
There is a picture of him at the age of 25, where you might think he was 50.
Das heißt also, hat sein Leben doppelt gelebt. Aber eins kann man auf jeden Fall sagen.
You might think that he'd lived his life twice over, but you can say one thing: he was always a loyal servant of his country.
Und ich denke, davon können wir auch heute lernen.
I think we can learn from that.
Für eine gute Sache einstehen, für eine gute Sache zu kämpfen und sie zu einem siegreichen Abschluss zu bringen.